to our next persuasion debate. I'm really looking forward to this one. I think it's on a really important topic that isn't sort of squarely in the middle, in the center of the kinds of things we think about at persuasion, but which we need to answer if we want to actually make this project work. And that is how to build an economy in which as many people as possible actually can take part in the economic growth and the progress that we're making. And I would think that Zephyr Teachout and Martin Sandbu each have just very slightly different emphases on this. And I thought it would be very interesting to put those in conversation with each other. So Zephyr Teachout in her excellent new book is really thinking about the threat that monopoly plays to our ability to have a vibrant economy in which people can actually take part. And Martin Sandbu, in a slightly different, or perhaps slightly broader sense, is thinking about how we, and to him that means particularly the left, it means that to Zephyr too, can create a sense of belonging, can create an economics that is not only inclusive, but that makes people feel like they have a real stake in their communities and some control over their lives. So, Zephyr, why don't you start off by telling us why for you monopoly is really at the heart of this conversation? When we ask this broader question, why is it that you think, to a large extent, the answer should revolve around monopoly?
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having this. And I really look forward to the conversation, both with Martin and with you, Yasha, and then with the people who are here joining us. As I understand it, you have been talking about crises of democracy. And I myself come as a scholar of democracy and an activist and a politician. And I have come to believe that one of the central democratic threats is something that you might traditionally think of, or at least in the last 40 years think of it in the United States, as not belonging in the democracy category, but sort of solely in the economic category. But this is the threat of concentrated private power, which I'm going to talk about as a monopoly problem. I think of monopoly, the word, as being very similar to the word corruption, which is where I historically have written about and focused on, in that it has a contemporary legal meaning as defined by current courts. And again, my focus is on the US. But it also has an incredibly broad, rich political history. And so monopoly has these dual meanings. And unfortunately, for the last really 40 years, monopoly policy, concentrated private power, when we should allow mergers, when we should break companies up, when we should use public utility regulation, when we should allow coordination to allow for a co-op model. All of those questions have actually been shoved aside and have not been at the center of American politics. Instead, the language of monopoly was really taken over by the Reagan Revolution in 1980. For 40 years, a monopoly policy has been treated as a technocratic job for professional economists. And the core principle animating contemporary anti-monopoly policy has just been consumer welfare and, in practice, consumer prices. Basically, we're not worried about concentrated private power unless it makes your toothpaste more expensive. That's the only core worry. And so what I'm trying to do in the book that I've just come out with and in my activism is engage both the left and independents and right, although I'm very focused on progressives, in reintroducing anti-monopoly politics, not as a side issue, but actually as a central issue that informs everything that we do. And so I actually think this is an area where Martin and I are probably going to agree, is that we basically want to talk a lot about power and how power is organized. And a central job of politics is making sure that concentrated private power doesn't become a form of government, a private form of government. So what is the impact of us sidelining anti-monopoly policy and leaving it to the economists and to a contemporary ideology? Well, in the last 11 years, we had 500,000 mergers worldwide. We're talking major mergers, not just small ones. DuPont merged with Dow, Monsanto and Bayer merged. You probably paid attention to Amazon and Whole Foods, Walmart and Bonobos. These are just some examples. And I argue that we should see these as political moments, sort of see them through the lens of Shakespeare, understanding that these are political marriages designed to consolidate power and have real insidious political effects that we have, along with our formal democracy, a functional other form of private government that we have to address. So anti-monopoly, I use the word monopoly to basically mean, as Milton Friedman did, when a company essentially has governing power, can set the terms of an interaction, as opposed to being having to negotiate interaction, like Gilead setting drug prices as it wishes, or Amazon setting the prices of the goods that it sells, as opposed to the seller setting those prices. We can talk more about that. But the main thing I want to get across is that monopoly is a major driver of inequality, that we have a lot of evidence that concentrated power and markets with concentrated power, which is many, many markets right now, actually really suppress wages. Some economists recently estimated at about $14,000 a year going to investors instead of workers in concentrated industries. So it has massive inequality effects. It also has these effects that I hope we get to talk about more, which is that it changes people's relationship to their employer or to these big companies to be an increasingly political one. Companies are increasingly spying on the politics of their workers. And it's profoundly humiliating, disempowering position to be in when you are a seller on Amazon or a chicken farmer having to go through Tyson. And this leads to a kind of rational paranoia, and that rational paranoia then infects our politics in other ways. That we can no longer separate the questions of concentrated private power and democracy. So we'll talk about this more, but my core urge is for politics to reincorporate anti-monopoly at the core of what we do. And that we need to actually move very aggressively to break up this rival form of government, this oligarchic form. Sometimes I think it's a little bit like the mafia that is burrowing its way into our government. What I'm talking about is actually not that radical. Well, where Martin calls himself a radical, I would call myself, in this sense, just hearkening back in many ways to the anti-monopoly policy of the post-FDR years through 1980. But I do actually think that we need to not just return to pre-Reagan era, but especially because of big tech and especially because of some contemporary challenges and the fact that we're so much more concentrated than we were in 1940, will require actually passing new laws as well as returning to 1980, to the 1940s, 1980s. The return part that I think is important is returning to an understanding that private power has tyrannical elements in it. And this is a problem for democracy, not just for professional economists.
You know, mostly there's a lot of speakers who have very catchy book titles, and when we start to speak and what they say is not so catchy, but you have both very, very important catchy things to say, and a catchy book title, which I should mention, which is Break 'em Up, Recovering Our Freedom from Big Tech and Big Money. It really rolls over the tongue. I'm going to call you up when I have to name my next book. Now, Martin, I think you agree with many of Zephyr's themes. I guess you look at it both in a more international perspective, where Zephyr is mostly focused on the United States. You're based in London. You have a Norwegian background, if I recall correctly, and you've lived for a long time in the United States. So you look at it in a more international perspective. And in your book, you talk particularly about this idea that the left actually needs to reclaim a sense of belonging, but it needs economic policies that allow people to have a sense of belonging. Tell us a little bit about how this story plays out in the international perspective and why for you this concept of belonging is so important.
Thanks, Yasha, and thanks, Zephyr. Yeah, thanks for having me. And I couldn't hear anything in what Zephyr said that I disagreed with. But you're right. I take a more kind of international comparative perspective in my book, which I call The Economics of Belonging, because it's really about trying to analyze and describe the economic roots of the sort of divisive politics we have today. And just to start with a point you hinted at, Yasha, I write about Western countries, what we used to call the industrialized world, in general, because we see the same processes, the same phenomena, both politically and economically, pretty much everywhere, to different degrees. The US is a particularly extreme case, and the monopoly problems are particularly bad in the US. But more broadly, we see across the Western world a phenomenon that I've called it the end of belonging. So I'll try to explain why. But in the first part of the book, I show how pretty much everywhere you had this big change around 1980. So you had 3 decades and a bit after the Second World War, where in one country after another, you saw people, the economy bringing people closer together. Inequality fell in terms of wages, it fell in terms of wealth, poorer regions caught up with the richer capital cities in every country. So across the board, you had this convergence of people all finding a place, a decent place in a national economy. And sort of around 1980, though, that convergence everywhere either stagnated or went into reverse. And you had divergence, you had growing inequality of wages, growing inequality of wealth, poorer regions now falling behind the richer regions, and so on. And that's what I call the end of economic belonging. And I try to make an argument that this is really at the bottom of the toxic politics we see, again, to greater or lesser degrees in different countries, but the direction is sort of the same everywhere. So one big point is that something's been going on that's very deep, that's common across the industrialized world. And so we need to think about the common causes, even though when we think about policies for specific countries, we want to take into account the particularities. But there's something common going on, a big common phenomenon. So let's be clear about that. And that phenomenon, I mean, in a sense, it's sort of obvious. The good jobs have gone, right? The question is why. So I argue that it's not really about globalization. It's inevitable technological change. You just don't need as many people on factory floors anymore. You don't need as many people doing clerical work anymore because you have computers. You don't need as many people in shops anymore because you're getting online retail. All of these things that keep changing, but they change in a way that unless you have the right policies in place, you get increased inequalities. So we were sort of lucky with the economic structure of the first 3 post-war decades, where the growth of industrial jobs were kind of very conducive to spreading the wealth. And the newer kinds of jobs are not really, because they favor those with higher education, they favor those in the cities, they favor those who are willing to move to the cities and have the means to move to the cities, and so on. What do we do about it? There's a lot of things we have to do about it, and it depends a bit from country to country. But I think one big point I want to just put on the table to start with is that what is missing and what we need to restore and what we used to have is an opportunity for everyone, or as near as possible everyone, to actually play a productive role in work in the economy so that they actually get paid well directly in the market. Right? So you don't need to think about redistributing because some people are super rich and some are super poor, but everyone already gets a pretty decent position where they are productive and get the rewards of that productivity. I mean, that's a very broad principle. But I try in the book to set out a whole series of policy areas of how you would think about policy if this is what you were aiming for, and pointing out that there are countries that have done this a lot better than the US, than the UK, and there are similar problems in the continental European countries too, France and so on. The European Nordics have managed to embrace technological growth, not hold on to the jobs of the past, keep productivity growth high, keep wages high at the lower end, been pretty liberal with immigration, and have avoided to some extent the toxicity of the politics in some of the other countries. There are problems there too, but they show that it's possible to combine productivity and fairness, and that the way that the gold standard, if you like, is to have an economy where everyone actually finds a productive role. Now, let me link this to Zephyr's specific theme. I have a chapter in the book. It's not called Monopoly, but it's called disempowerment or empowerment, policies for empowerment. So I like to think about disempowerment. And one aspect of the really divisive economic settlement we've had for the last 3-4 decades in all Western countries is that there are people who end up disempowered. And that's just a word to capture these stories we all know about, people who struggle to make ends meet, even if they have 2-3 jobs, people who are time constrained, who don't have any cash in the bank to take a couple of weeks off if they are ill, or if they need to do something for their family, or if they want to take a course to retrain themselves. There are all these things that trap people. And that's a form of disempowerment. And what I think we need to do, not just because it's good for people to be empowered, but because it's good for productivity if people are empowered, is to deal with disempowerment. I mentioned 3 dimensions, and maybe Zephyr will want to come back and talk about sort of which dimension her work is mostly about. But I very briefly address disempowerment first in the labor market. This is what we think of, the precariat, people with really crappy jobs that aren't enough to live on, let alone live well, and that are so badly paid and so insecure and so unsafe and so bad for your health that you can't even get out of them because you're trapped. But there are also power imbalances in product markets. And Zephyr did mention some of this. You think about the new entrepreneur, the startup, the person who wants to, create some new product or make some new product that's better than what's on the market. And, they sell on Amazon, for example. Amazon finds out this is a good line of business, and then they change the algorithm so they sell their own stuff instead. That's another form of disempowerment, right? And market concentration, where new incomers don't actually have a chance to grow and compete with the established giants, that's also bad for productivity. So precarious labor markets are bad for productivity because people don't get to develop their skills. Market concentration in product markets is bad for productivity because it stops people with new ideas and new ways of doing things from deploying that, applying that. And then, of course, there's data, where it's obvious that we also have huge power imbalances. And we're only kind of starting to see how badly that can go. There's an international dimension where we have a sort of trade conflict going on already about how data is going to be governed. So that's a third dimension of power imbalances, where I think a good economic policy needs to address all of those. I'm already taking quite a lot of time for my opening remarks. I'm not going to go into sort of how do you deal with it. But I just want to say, before we continue the conversation, that I think this is just as important, should be just as important for the center-right as it is for the center-left or the progressive left or the center, whatever you want to call it. I mean, these are good capitalist concerns. Market concentration is bad for capitalism. It's bad for making free markets work as well as they can. It's bad for productivity growth. It's bad for the economy. In the long run, I think it's probably bad even for most capitalists themselves. Maybe, there are those who manage to extract the most rents who are better off. But I bet most of you don't know which country between the US and Norway has more multimillionaires per capita. But it turns out that is Norway. So, you can be a good, fair, egalitarian society and have a lot of room for making good money. So this is important for the center-right too. Let me just stop there and we can go on.
So Martin, what's the point of being a millionaire or billionaire if you have to be all sober and Norwegian about it, rather than being able to flaunt your wealth in the way you can in America? I'm not sure that quite cuts. No, I'm joking. No,
but if you promote my book enough that it's a huge bestseller, then I'll let you know when I'm a multimillionaire.
Well, excellent. There's a proud line of lefty economists and activists who become millionaires and have to apologize for it. So Martin's book, by the way, for everybody, is The Economics of Belonging, a Radical Plan to Win Back the Left Behind and Achieve Prosperity for All. So this sounds great. I mean, I'm persuaded by a lot of the analysis, but as Martin was alluding to at the end, I have no idea how to get there. How do we make sure that a few big companies don't run all of our economy, which sounds ambitious enough, and how do we make sure, going beyond that we don't even need that much redistribution because we restructure the economy in such a way that everybody has great wages to begin with? Go.
Well, I do want to just underline the question and the comment that Martin made, which is a core idea here, is that a lot of, and I'll speak as a progressive right now, a lot of progressive policy is focused on taxation, which I strongly support. And sometimes there's a false dichotomy between on the left about whether or not you want to be an anti-monopolist and focus on market structure or focus on tax policy. And I actually think that it's not only a false dichotomy, it's the reverse. It's only through policies that reduce private concentrated power, which then gets plowed into lobbying and politics, can we get to a more fair taxation system. However, the goal should be a system where wealth cannot be amassed in this gross way, because we know that Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates and Bernard Arnault, to speak of a European monopolist, and Michael Bloomberg, all of these are the richest people in the world. All of them got their money through wealth. And there's an old idea that I think we need to return to, is the understanding that monopoly is a form of theft. And maybe the analogy that helps you understand it is thinking of a highway robber standing at the narrow pass saying you have to give 30% of your money, otherwise you can't continue. And American anti-monopoly laws like the Sherman Act have a criminal component, even though it isn't used, because to monopolize is to be in a position where you are stealing value from those workers and producers, sellers of goods that Martin was talking about. So we'll just use Bezos because of the recent hearing and because we've started talking about that. Martin's right that Amazon steals ideas and then sells its own. But a shocking fact that we just learned in the last 10 days is that 30 cents out of every dollar that you spend on Amazon is now going to Amazon. So basically the tariff, this private government's taxation of sellers is 30%, which is an extraordinary amount. I don't think it's a coincidence that Apple's current tariff tax on developers is also 30%. So 30% of every dollar that you spend on Apple Store is also going to Apple. So these is a form of theft to use this platform power. And if we correctly police that form of theft, then yes, we'll still have great taxation policy, but we're going to have to do less at the far end. So some people say, oh, you're not radical enough because you're not focusing enough on taxation. I actually think that people who are focusing on taxation aren't radical enough because they're not focusing on power. And then if you don't deal with accumulated power and the way in which money is accumulated in the first place, it's much harder to claw it back at the back end. So a short answer to your question, Yasha, is a key part of the politics is a finding of a common cause between small business owners and labor. And there's just the beginning of that in the US, but it's really hard. And that was an essential part of FDR's second term, is a joining of two communities that might see each other as really alien, but that we'll use Amazon again because I think it's useful. Amazon workers and labor unions who are fighting against Amazon's labor policy, who see how Amazon owning both the marketplace and the warehouses and using its marketplace power to have bad working conditions, especially during the pandemic at the warehouses, is bad for workers, is connected. It's a similar abuse of power to how sellers are getting abused by having to give up 30% and being threatened. So a key broad part of the politics is a joining of small business owners and labor. And that's like, these are groups that haven't worked together, but are going to need to work together to recognize a common enemy.
It's a really good point, actually. And I mean, it's tended to be the center right that speaks to, well, in good times, it's been the center right that speaks to small business owners. In really bad times, it's been the fascists that speak to small business owners. That's always been the risk. It's sort of the petty bourgeoisie that tends to bring fascists to power. So crucial. And a really important political point to try to build those coalitions. I'll just follow up with some concrete ideas. So in the book, I mentioned a number of ideas. So I agree with all the problems that Zephyr spells out. Sitting in Europe, albeit in London, which is kind of an ironic place to be saying this, but Brussels, of course, has actually done this a lot better over the last 10, 20 years. Like all good liberals and all FT journalists, I'm a big fan of the competition commissioner, Margrethe Vestager, who has really tried to stop some of these abuses, right? The legislation isn't quite developed enough, but you have a consumer-friendly champion in the European Commission. And those who haven't read Thomas Philippon's book, The Great Reversal, should take a look at it. He shows that over the last 20 years, market power has become much more concentrated in the US, whereas competition policy has strengthened in the EU to the extent that, what used to be the sclerotic EU and the dynamic US, they've reversed positions. Very instructive case, including because it shows how quickly things can change. So that's kind of a cause for optimism. If you get the policies right, you can change things reasonably fast, especially in a fast-changing economy. A couple of just concrete ideas. So I would want governments to put in place policies that either completely separated marketplace services from actual product selling. So you have to choose, are you going to be a marketplace or are you going to be a seller, a vendor on the market? But, we can talk about the details of how to do that, but basically it would stop Amazon, say, from doing this sort of thing, Apple from doing this sort of thing. I would want policies that, some form of compulsory licensing, if you like, so that anything that has a systemic role as a marketplace needs to be open. And really open without charging extortionate prices. So there need to be a way to to present your app to phone users without having to go through a monopoly gatekeeper, or that gatekeeper has to be regulated as a utility. So does that mean? It probably means you have to split them up. Maybe there is behavioral regulation, conduct regulation that can substitute, but that's the direction you need to go. In product market, there's something that logically is sort of equivalent. You need to make it easy for workers to go away from to leave abusive work situations and workplaces. How do you do that? Well, you make it affordable to go between jobs. So, I think the main case for a universal basic income is not that it is the best way to defeat poverty, because there are probably better, more targeted ways, but because it's the best way to allow every worker to be able to say no to unacceptable demands and conditions. You can leave your job. So it should be a basic principle that everyone can say no and leave their job and go and look for another one, and have the wherewithal to take the 2 weeks, a month to search for a new one without having to, starve in the meantime. Here's a fact I bet most of you don't know, at least I don't hear people talk enough about it. In Europe, the countries that have the highest rate of job market churn, so the rate of shifting from one job to another, are Denmark, Sweden, number 2, and I think Finland, number 3. And this is not because companies there chew up their workers and spit them out. It's because people move from decent jobs to better jobs. And there are policies in place to make that easy and encourage that. That's good for productivity. And it's also good for freedom of empowerment, because it's easier to leave. So we need policies like that in product markets too, in labor markets too, sorry.
I'm a sort of a, I grew up with my mouth being washed out with soap if I swore. So I very rarely swear. But I have one swear in my book that very much relates to what Martin is talking about, which is I talk about how we need a fuck off economy, which is from a good friend of mine who is Bill Longman, who writes about healthcare markets. And, but the idea is that you need the capacity to know that you could leave. And that awareness that you could leave changes everything about your job and everything about your life. And you may hold that knowledge in your heart and never act on it. But the awareness that you could leave, take those 2 weeks off, switch jobs, changes your, not only your economic relationship, negotiating relationship to your boss, it changes your ability to, by the way, negotiate on things like arbitration clauses that limit your ability to sue. Because if you could leave, then it's plausible for you to say, no, I actually, if you later discriminate me against me on the basis of age, I want to be able to sue you in court, not through arbitration. But it also, I think, changes the human spirit. And this is one of the things I really want to encourage is, and maybe this is an area we'll find some disagreement, but allowing people to feel confidence talking about market structure in a way that they don't. People feel often very confident. Well, I'll get to that in a second. But it affects the human spirit in that if you think that you can't leave, if you think you can't say fuck off to your boss, that It changes your ability to share on social media some political view, not because they would punish you, but because the possibility they would punish you would then impact how you moved in that workplace. That it leads to a shrinking of a moral, of your ability to act as a moral agent in the world. And then if we want
sometimes it leads to outright abuse.
And at least outright abuse. Yes, right.
Yes,
thank you.
In the worst cases, yeah. No, let's not forget about that too. Right.
Right. Yeah. So that's a test, is the ability to shift. But so Martin, I'm looking for areas, because this was somewhat advertised as a debate, and I've read a lot of your stuff and I love it. It's a great chance to meet you. But one thing I really care about is taking back the possibility to talk about this stuff for the public, to sort of have populist economic policy. And maybe you don't disagree with me on this, but in antitrust in particular, there's an enormous amount of intimidation. People feel like, okay, I may not know taxes, but I may not be an economist, but I want higher taxes. I may not be an economist, but I think people should get at least $25 an hour. You don't have to be a labor markets economist to say that. But when it comes to mergers, they say, well, I don't know what the HHI index is, and I don't know how to define a market. And there's this, I think, a real intimidation. And I know you've written somewhat critically about it's been a little while, so you can remind me, but about those of us who are trying to say, don't trust the professional economists too much, because we want to empower people to make claims about monopoly power and excessive power in this area, and to not feel like they need to know all the sort of technocratic language in order to say that there's a real problem.
Yeah, I think some of that is economists' fault. I mean, I do often say that economics and economic policy is too important to leave to economists.
Okay.
But I have been critical of there's a sort of revolutionary movement going on, wanting to throw out everything that's been done in economics, mainstream economics, because it's blamed for neoliberalism, if that's what you want to call it. And even though there have been problems, my irritation has been that there are so many good arguments for the sort of policies we support in mainstream economics that it's a sort of strange internal kind of warfare among progressives that this becomes, really. I mean, let's just take your concept of the fuck-off labor market to the wider economy, and it's a good term. My colleague Sarah O'Connor, who writes about employment at the FT, she's written occasionally about the fuck-off index, she calls this. There's a number of voluntary quits in the economy. So you can look at these statistics. If a lot of people are quitting their jobs, it means they have some power, right? It means that they're not afraid of leaving. Or if there are more quits than there are involuntary firings. But we should have the same in product markets, right? I think this is a way to communicate what you were just talking about. Don't go into the details of the Herfindahl index with a merger, but talk about, does this mean you can say no to this supplier and go to a different one, right? So in the US, at least when I lived there, and I think this is no better, maybe worse, you can't choose between cable providers, can you? I mean, internet broadband providers, mostly, in most places. I mean, that's an outrage, right? That's why it's so expensive and so slow. I mean, that's not hard to explain to people, but you need people to explain it, and you need politicians to explain it as well. This is one thing the Competition Commissioner in Brussels does a good job of, but you need more of that. But there is a language for it. It means, you should be able to tell, pick your favorite hated internet provider and tell them to FO and choose somebody else. But again, this is a pretty broad argument, a pretty common sense argument that should work with the center-right and center-right voters just as well as center-left voters. It's just saying, look, you want to be able to choose. Freedom, choice, markets. There's a way to tell that story.
And one of the areas that I actually don't write about as much, but I know you're familiar with, is the incredible concentration within supply chains.
Yeah.
And I think the pandemic really revealed that to a lot of people by making it so clear, and this actually very much then relates to questions about trade, is that when you have radically consolidated supply chains that you might not see in the same way that you see the absence of choice in your cable markets, but it turns out there's just a few places that you're getting sort of key equipment for ventilators or other PPE. that the absence of redundancy and the total the total concentration of supply chains, often in other countries, who then have political control over those supply chains, also leads to, I think, it sort of opened people's eyes to the political component of trade and the way in which, for instance, Chinese power over sort of key sources in medical equipment is not just sort of is not disconnected from politics. And I think that one of the areas, again, I haven't written nearly as much about trade as you have. I write about the US primarily, not trade policy. But I think trade and monopoly are actually deeply connected in these ways. And that a positive sort of move in trade policy from the US perspective would be a real focus on, say, taking this moment and recognizing, okay, we shouldn't put all our eggs in one national basket when it comes to medical supply chains, food supply chains, or for that matter, any supply chains. And that there's a real value in decentralization in supply chains, not just multiple different sources, but multiple different countries. Otherwise, it leads to this radical political dependency on the country that effectively has national control over those supply chains.
Yeah, I agree with that. What I sort of really want to warn against there is to kind of slide from there into economic nationalism, because I think the answer here is that, in a sense, you need more globalization, right? You need more suppliers in more countries. So, what you described, we've seen in lots of countries during the pandemic, in the US, but also lots of European countries. And I think we also realize that supply chain concentration is particularly tricky, because I think even the companies themselves don't always realize how brittle it can be, right? How everyone seems to depend on this one ball bearings company in somewhere inland China, or whatever. I'm making this up, but that sort of thing. Apparently, Hubei province was where a lot of this PPE was made. You're kind of unlucky that way. But I think probably a lot of even the companies themselves in the supply chain didn't quite realize this. So there's a problem with how this is not very transparent. Now, I don't think the answer is let's repatriate everything, partly because it would end up being more expensive and you'd probably end up with less of what you need when the crisis comes. But of course, you want to make sure that you're resilient. But what that means is that you probably want to, there are a lot of things you can do short of repatriating everything. You can have public regulations that require stockpiling. So there was a nice story in the FT back in March, April about how Switzerland was doing reasonably well avoiding shortages, not just of PPE, but other things, because they have this stockpiling system in place since the days of the Cold War, and probably even earlier, where they have publicly owned stockpiles in bunkers in the mountains. And, there are a list of things that have to be stocked in case there's a nuclear war. That turned out to be pretty useful. But there's nothing about globalization or open borders or trade that stops any country from doing that. You just have to want to do it. So you need to pay the cost of some duplication and some stockpiling. So that's one thing you can do. Another thing you can do is to require companies themselves to build more duplication and redundancy and resilience into their supply chain. So, you can add to the accounting requirements and transparency requirements some sort of audit of vulnerability that says, look, if this bit of your supply chain shuts down, what alternatives do you have? So maybe you need to have 2 supplies of everything. I mean, this could get expensive, but, safety has a cost. My point is just that we can think about this without getting it into the globalization versus nationalism axis.
Well, let me jump in here for 1 second. First of all, let me just thank the two of you, because before every one of these debates, I say, just tee off each other, it doesn't all have to go. It never works, and this is working wonderfully. Second, I just want to invite everybody to come in on the debate. So if you have a question, if you have a brief comment, feel free to raise your hand, and I'll call on you very soon. But I think, have one other area where I wonder whether we disagree with each other, or perhaps I disagree with you, or I'm just confused about it. And that is around this question of monopoly, because Martin said that a lot of the reasons for this monopolization is technological. That there are just reasons about the structure of our economy that make that. And then I think, Zephyr has very good reasons why that's worrying, and Martin agrees with those. But I guess I'm trying to picture what the world would or should look like once we've dealt with those. Because I want monopoly at one level, right? I want to be able to go to a place like Amazon and all of the different sellers are in that place. I don't have to look at 3 or 4 different websites to figure out what the different alternatives are. They are all in one. That makes my life so much easier. That's why even though I have certain concerns about it, like I'm sure many of you, I end up using it. That's true, of course, for social media platforms as well, right? The whole point of something like Facebook or Twitter is that you want everybody to be on the same platform, because otherwise half your friends are on one platform, the other half on another platform. And again, that's a problem. So is the problem exactly that we have monopolies in those things now and we don't want monopolies? Or is it that we'll still have monopolies, it's just they will be regulated in a way and the ownership structures will be such that they can't extract sort of unfair rent, but it still sort of essentially will be a monopoly in the user experience and in all users being on the same social media platform, or all sellers being on the same market where they can compete with each other to sell their goods. And that's a question to Ivo.
Great.
Yeah. Just 2 quick thoughts about that. So one is the phenomenon you describe, that the efficient scale of operation is very big and maybe global. That's right, but it's also true for actually quite a lot of non-digital things, right? That the optimal scale of production has become bigger, and that's why you see these tendencies towards market concentration. So it's a broader problem, although we see it's particularly extreme in digital and data. But the second thought is, yeah, it's great to have a marketplace where you can find everything. But, we're bundling together a bunch of things here, right? One is the marketplace itself. You can search for things and they come up on your list and you can choose what you want to buy. Another thing is the algorithm that sorts these things. So you can want the one to be single, a monopoly, if you like, but want to have competition between algorithms or some sort of openness among algorithms. And a third thing is who sells on it, right? So there are sort of many dimensions of this, and we shouldn't accept that they all need to be bundled together. So as I was hinting at before, maybe you just need to regulate, separate out the marketplace bit. I mean, another element is the data people put into it. So my data, your data, when you search, should one company also have all of that just because you need one company or one marketplace? Well, I mean, it shouldn't follow necessarily, right? So I'm very excited about this solid project that Tim Berners-Lee is leading, but trying to find new technological solutions for keeping the data local and only sharing as much as you want. I think in the end, we'll have to hope for some technological solutions to get the best of most worlds, if not all worlds. But in the meantime, separate these different functions out.
Yeah, I actually think tech actually can get in the way of our ability to think sometimes. It's like it has this mystical effect and people just start hand waving and saying tech is different in some fundamental ways. Look, as Martin was saying, Google has no business owning Google Flights and choosing to prefer Google Flights over its competitors. Amazon, you may want Amazon, we'll talk about that in a second. You may want Amazon, the marketplace, to be unitary or to have maybe 2 or 3, a handful. But Amazon, the marketplace, does not need to own Amazon, the warehouses, AWS, Echo, Nest. There's incredible cost to this radical building up of power and leveraging one platform to build power in another. So basic principle, the most essential principle is that concentrated private power leads to inequality and despotism. And we need prophylactic methods to stop it, as opposed to after the fact saying, well, was that a monopoly move or was that a monopoly move? Instead, prophylactically say, watch out. Concentrated private power is a problem. We're not going to allow Google to buy a company a week as it did in 2011. People sort of have a naturalist metaphor sometimes, like they must be all these things. These are actually conglomerates that bought up. Facebook bought Amazon, bought Instagram, WhatsApp to stop them from challenging their power. So no concentrated, unregulated private power. In many cases, that's Glass-Steagall. So you say, if you're a tractor company like John Deere, you can't also be a financier. That's a real problem. You separate functions. And the reason I use John Deere is we just got to get away, as Martin was saying, from the idea that tech is somehow different, because a lot of times it's not. And then there are areas where tech plays, big concentrated tech is valuable for the network effects. And it is uniquely pernicious that it is not regulated as a public utility, because, for instance, Google and Facebook make money off of targeted ads, which is a business model that we would never allow our communications infrastructure to be based on. The idea that our sidewalks, mail services, or public library would prioritize the stuff that would keep us there and addicted as long as possible is really dark and weird. So once we say, okay, we want a communications infrastructure, let's fund it in a way that doesn't actually undermine communications and democracy. So I think the simplest way to think about it is break up by function, break up by size where you don't have the value of network effects. And then where you do, then you have public utility regulation, which is, a version of what the language is different in Europe, but a version of what Martin was talking about in terms of access, non-discrimination regimes. But it's so important that you ask this, Yasha, because I think so often when people think break up, they think, oh, well, then I won't get, say, next day delivery. Or if we break up Uber and no longer allow SoftBank to run the town for hail cars, then we'll no longer be able to press a button and get a ride somewhere. The technology and the business model are different things, and we should not confuse technology and business model. And tech has like bamboozled us into thinking we can't have nice things unless they're monopolized. And that's just not true. And in fact, it's leading to incredible inequality.
All right, great. So let's go to, we have a few questions to start with. Karen, go ahead.
Great, fantastic conversation. And my question piggybacks off the last comments. So I started my career as a community developer doing anti-poverty work, and then I worked for the government, and I kind of saw all these trends happening, and I jumped into the tech world. And I had this really idealistic idea about creating a platform for wholesaling that would be more transparent and that would give more power back to small businesses and ethical businesses and domestic businesses. But the kind of implicit or ambient kind of feedback that you get in the tech world is that there is no way to be profitable unless you are a monopoly. So that there has to be a concentration of investment in a very few companies who have the hope of becoming a unicorn. So I'm not sure, and I haven't looked at the balance sheets of a lot of these unicorns, so I don't know. But is this propaganda, or is this a statement about the realities of gaining market penetration in the US versus Norway? I mean, Norway is a much smaller country. The US is a very big country, and it is probably just take a lot more capital and kind of strength to get market penetration. So I was curious to get your feedback on that thought.
Well, Buffett famously has told his investors that what he most wants to invest in is a monopoly. Give me a monopoly. Peter Thiel says the same thing. And the truth is, and who else says the same thing? Charles Dickens. These guys aren't geniuses, by the way. In Great Expectations, there's this thing that says, just give me some capital and a monopoly and I'll make you rich. So this is a very old idea. This isn't like genius Buffett business. So the problem is we don't enforce our existing laws and we don't have strong enough laws. And this is where Europe is doing a better job. And if those laws were enforced, then you'd have capital. I mean, I don't know your product, so I can't promise you that, but that investors are going to flock to monopoly rents when they're there. And so this is how monopolization and financialization are deeply connected. If you want money to go towards innovation, new ideas, as opposed to sitting on top of a narrow passageway where you can collect taxes or rents or whatever you want to call it, then you've actually got to create incentives so that private equity is no longer saying, oh, let's roll up 50 different nursing homes because we can start paying nurses less. It says, oh, our money isn't going to go there. So I think of anti-monopoly as essential to dealing with the financialization problem in our economy and to supporting people with new ideas like the ones you're talking about.
I didn't anticipate that the headline coming out of this event would be Zephyr teacher to entrepreneurs try to build a monopoly, but there we are. Michael and then Avi.
So what are the chances that that when we're looking back at the year 2020, 30 years from now, we're going to realize that we're already living in a world with a privately run government? And how would that, and if we think about things that way, how do we think about things like civil rights or so when people talk about free speech, they say, oh, well, these are private platforms, and so that doesn't really apply. And I'm not really sure how those arguments should a lot of those things should be talked about once we realize that we've been using old terminology, not realizing that these places are more like government than and our governments themselves are actually kind of outdated. Just want to have your comment on that.
So I'll just be brief, and I'm actually really interested to hear what Martin has to say. I think that in political theory, or at least popular political theory, but I used to be more in the poli-sci world too, there's a weird formalism as opposed to functionalism when it comes to what is government. So in all kinds of other areas, people say, it looks like a duck and walks like a duck, therefore we'll call it a duck. But when it comes to what is governing, we look at who's elected, who calls herself mayor, who calls herself senator. So to follow on what you're saying, our functional communications infrastructure right now is Facebook and Google. They're controlling our news industry.
Right, they're the ones governing it, right?
Yeah, right. And Barry Lynn has done great work in this area, showing the way in which Walmart governs its suppliers. This isn't about tech, by telling, this is 15 years ago, telling Coca-Cola what sweetener to use. When Tyson decides it's going to switch what hormones are acceptable, it's more powerful than an agriculture regulator acting. These are forms of private regulation. So I think we're right in between right now. I don't think we're totally taken over, but if you talk to many people in business, they care more about the private regulators than the public regulators. So that, anyway, what are the chances? I don't know. I think we're at a crucible moment. I think we're at a really exciting anti-monopoly moment, but we're also at a power grab moment. And a lot of these big companies are using the tyranny and corruption and sort of horrific nature of Donald Trump to excuse their own power grab. And so I really do see it as a Scylla and Charybdis. And I've worked a lot on Trump, sued him. He's a genuine threat. But we can't sort of run away from Trump into these big private forms of government. And I'm quite concerned about it.
I would warn against being too fatalistic here. I mean, if elections and democracy and citizens didn't matter, then these companies wouldn't bother to spend a hell of a lot of money trying to manipulate them, right? And it matters that Trump is trying to destroy governing institutions. It matters because he's trying to destroy them, and it matters that he's trying because they actually play a function, partly to rein in the purely private governing that you're talking about. Look, it depends which country you're talking about too, of course. The US is sort of further down a bad road than most other Western democracies, liberal democracies. Look, when the EU introduced the GDPR regulations, the privacy laws for personal data, why did that happen? Well, it certainly wasn't because of company lobbying or the big tech lobbying. They didn't want it. But it was largely because there was enough of a political push that had to do with citizens' personal preferences. Of course, there will have been competitors to some companies that have wanted it too. But it was largely a democratic process, full of flaws like always, but a pretty good one. And what happened later? I mean, Zephyr and most of you will know more about it this bit, but California has been trying to, has been following suit, right? They've seen, okay, this can be done. There's a big set of rules in Europe that governs, 1/3 of the world economy. Let's, try to coordinate here. Let's have something here too. And things move, right? So don't be too fatalistic about this. Final answer. When I was an undergraduate, I read a book that made a big difference to my thinking ever since, which is Stephen Lukes's Power, A Radical View, which talks about different conceptions of power. But the deepest and most important concept of power, is the power to make people, to induce people to believing that they want certain things that are good for you. So maybe it's because sort of ideas are the weapon that I can wield that I think ideas matter, but I think ideas matter a lot. So the fact that we're having this conversation is part of the solution, a very small part, but at least it's part of it.
On the idea that ideas matter a lot, certainly is at the heart of this community. Let's collect the last questions. I don't want to go much beyond the full hour. So we'll go to Avi and Luke, and Andrew keeps raising his hand and lowering it again. So I'm not sure he wants to come in or not, but we'll go to Avi and Luke, and then Andrew if he wants to talk, and then we'll go back to Martin and Zephyr for a final round of responses. Avi, go ahead.
Muted.
No, I don't believe, Avi, you are muted. So perhaps there's a problem with your microphone. So let's go to Luke first, and then we'll revert back to Avi.
Hey there. So you're both experts on monopolization in modern societies, and clearly both agree quite readily. Putting aside the argument that breaking up monopolies yields more innovation, how do we deal with the argument that I believe Zuckerberg made, that breaking down many of these monopolies will render American society more vulnerable to foreign companies behaving the very way local monopolies used to behave pre-breakdown?
Great. Avi, can we
Good question.
Can we hear you now? Go ahead. Oh, well, now you are actually muted.
Okay, yes, thanks. So my question is a little bit in line with what Yasha was asking earlier, is that, well, one of you mentioned that you consider monopolies as a theft. I mean, I have many issues with monopolies, but I cannot call them theft since they do provide a service. I mean, people like their service and they do pay for it. And I think even the bigger question that I have is, at the end of the day, when I see monopolies, especially during this coronavirus time, I always think about herd behavior. And there's a herd behavior that's associated with monopolies. Well, why do people get an iPhone? Well, because everybody has an iPhone, right? And then why do people use Facebook? Because everybody uses Facebook. So maybe can you comment on this herd behavior that monopolies thrive upon? And it seems like it would be very difficult to stop specifically that herd behavior.
Great. And Andrew, do you want to come in or no? If so, you have 5 seconds to speak up.
Sure. I had raised my hand and then put it down because someone stole my question, but I got another one. So what would you, either of you have to say to the argument that we talked about Amazon a couple of times, that because they're breaking into other industries that have high barriers to entry that would otherwise be static. It's hard to imagine a company from scratch coming in and challenging someone like a Walmart or a Target. But they will use that and then they'll flip the profits around and use that to break into online streaming. We'd already mentioned internet service providers as large established companies that essentially stay out of each other's way, and a large company like Amazon could come in and shake things up a bit. So what would you, I don't necessarily find that argument convincing, but I also don't have a good counter argument to it. So thanks.
All right, you each have 3 minutes to answer 3 very small, straightforward questions.
Yeah. I think I'll leave the last question to Zephyr because it's quite specific about market structure, and she knows more about that than me. So let me try and answer the first 2. So Zuckerberg and those of his ilk will say, well, you know, if you break us up, then the Chinese will come in and take over everything. I mean, they said this very specifically about Libra, the electronic currency that they wanted to introduce, and that got every finance minister in the rich world and beyond to freak out and immediately say, no way until we have seen what you want to do and regulate it. Look, I think it's just a false claim, really. It's very self-serving, but it's false because the sort of policies that will break down a monopoly in the US will be equally efficient in preventing a monopoly takeover from somebody outside. It's even easier to stop a foreign company, from doing in the US what Facebook is doing in the US. So rules that make it impossible, if the rule is you can't have more than 20% of the market, well, that will apply to a foreign company too, right? So there are very simple answers to this. It depends how you do it specifically. And it would be stupid to break things up only to let a monopolist in from abroad, of course. But there's no reason why we would. So I don't buy that at all. And the other question was also a sort of either devil's advocate or some sympathy for the ultra billionaires. Monopolies do provide a useful service. Well, they do. That's how they got to where they are. But they also do two more things. The fact that they're monopolists means that they provide a less useful service than they could, or they do it at a higher price than they could, or they take more of your data and manipulate it than they could. So, what are you comparing with? Better than nothing, a whole lot worse than what you could have had. And we probably can't even imagine what a more competitive industry would produce, right? We couldn't even imagine what we would have now 20 years ago. So we just don't know what could come out of better regulation. But the other thing is that they, because they're monopolies, and for the reason that make them monopolies, they make it a lot harder to go without them. If everyone is, you said an iPhone, different phones are intercompatible, so that's not the best example. But if everyone is on the same social network, it's really bad not to be on it. So, the fact of their monopoly makes it worse for you not to have their service. So even usefulness is a bit of a slippery term here. It's become useful because it becomes so bad not to have it because it's the only choice. So, slippery language here. But the point is things could be much better. So usefulness is not enough.
So just very quickly, I shared a link directly to the Zuckerberg comment about China. Very much echoed what Martin was talking about. If you want to see it, it's a pro-market link. Great final questions. I absolutely agree with what Martin was just saying about the value. And if you're in a monopoly, if you're as a consumer facing a monopoly or purchaser facing a monopoly, your ultimate choices, your quality is eventually going to degrade. But I want to go one further, which is to say that the core change that we need to make when it comes to market structure thinking in this country, and I think Europe can still do a lot more, by the way. It's way ahead, but it still has a lot more to do, is no longer locating the consumer as the only value, and that understanding that that we are also workers, that we are also members of a political community, and that the consumer-only focus really separates ourselves from our other roles. And that once we debate on consumer-only lines, there's increasing evidence that Martin and I might win all of those debates, but the values are not just consumer values. And a lot of what I've been talking about would be called monopsony by economists, about the ways in which, but I'm quite happy when I want to use the popular term of monopoly so you feel confident, like is using their power to steal from the suppliers, from the workers, Avi, not just from the consumer. So it's moving beyond the consumer welfare. And then Andrew, to your question, it's exactly the kind of argument that the big monopolists are making right now. I think AT&T made this recently. Like, you have to allow us to merge, otherwise how are we going to deal with these other tech giants in these other arenas? And the answer is, just because we've made things bad doesn't mean we have to make things worse. But it is why it's important that we bring an overall anti-monopoly perspective, which is not just divestiture, but also supporting small and medium-sized businesses. And also, as Martin talks about in his book, really supporting making it a lot easier to unionize. And so supporting other power sources in many, many different ways, because otherwise we're just sort of in a fight between oligarchs. And that's the particular merger might make sense. Say, oh, we should allow that because otherwise there's, these cable companies are small next to Google. That shouldn't be the question. We as Martin was just ending with, and I think maybe people can't imagine it. We actually can have a thriving, productive, innovative, far more equal economy than we have, and still have a market economy. That we aren't stuck with just the choice between jettisoning a market economy. It doesn't have to move to this fight between oligarchs.
Wonderful. This is a great debate. Just a couple of housekeeping notes remain for me. The first is for everybody who's watching this on YouTube to check out our community at www.persuasion.community. The second is to invite you to some of our upcoming events. So we actually, today at 6 p.m. have the second half of a book club with David Frum about his new book, Trumpocalypse. We also have a book club this coming Wednesday at 9 p.m. About Lee Stein's wonderful satirical new novel called Self-Care. And then next Sunday, we're going to have a debate about the election, which is sort of easy to forget is happening, strangely enough, even though it's incredibly important and really not very, very, very long to go. And so we're going to be debating about whether or not Biden is winning, and if so, why. Finally, if you would like to join us for a little small group discussion after this has ended, please just stay behind. Obviously, feel free to drop and go about your Sunday doing other things, but you're very invited to stay behind and debate more about this topic. The last thing that remains for me to do is to give a very hearty thanks to Martin and Zephyr for being the first people in the history of persuasion debates to take me at my word and just run with it rather than having to have me ask them questions, and for your excellent contributions. Thank you so much to both of you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all so much. And thank you, Yasha.
All right, great. Thank you. That was amazing.